Everyone ready? Okay. Kia ora koutou, ko Juldobi toko anoa. It's my pleasure to introduce the fourth and the last Gibbons Lecture for 2022. Tonight we have another panel session and on the future of cloud computing in Aotearoa, New Zealand. The facilitator tonight is Danielle Lottridge. Danielle's best known to some of you as an expert in human-computer interaction. Her role tonight is as the School Industry Relationship Coordinator. Before starting at the University of Auckland, Danielle completed a PhD at the University of Toronto, went on to a postdoc at Stanford University, and then spent a couple of years working at Yahoo. So she's ideally suited to facilitate this panel.
Yeah, thank you, Jill. And so I am thrilled to present our panelists to you tonight. And so I'll introduce each of them in turn, and then we'll get right to discussing what is the future of cloud computing. And so I'll start off with Gareth Cronin. He is the General Manager for Developer Platform at Xero, New Zealand's most successful software company. And so coming from California, I met many tech evangelists there, which may be a term that's a little less common in New Zealand. And so Gareth is evangelizing technology critical to the transformation of New Zealand's economy, and also talking about the need for tech and supporting young people in their careers in tech. Prior to coming to Xero, Gareth founded Ambit, a conversational AI chatbot, and we may talk a little bit about that tonight as well. And had some experience consulting for Air New Zealand, Vista Entertainment, led engineering for crime analytics software, Orion Health, and Kiwi Plan. So lots of experience on this panel tonight. And he's one of our own computer science honors bachelor. So thanks for coming back and supporting the school. And Gareth has many interests, like mixing drinks, reading fiction, playing music, and still likes to code on the weekend.
That's right.
Awesome. Thanks for being here. And our next panelist, Teresa Corbilis, is the head of Google Cloud Financial Services in New Zealand, also a tech industry veteran. She started her career at as a telecoms industry analyst and led sales and marketing at Silicon Valley companies globally, including Hewlett-Packard, Ericsson, and Cisco. Teresa's passion is supporting women and girls to live up to their true potential. And she does this work within Google and within her communities to bring forth the voices of those in underrepresented communities to tell their own stories and empower them. Teresa's also mom to a 13-year-old and has a hubby who's also part of the school in psychology. So thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thanks, Danielle.
Yeah. And next we have Tony Buswell, the Chief Technology Officer of IBM New Zealand. Tony spent a few years with the New Zealand Army before spending 25 years in the ICT across public and private sectors, including Inland Revenue, New Zealand Transport Agency, the Ministry of Education, and Spark. Tony started as a technical engineer and has worked across operations, delivery, architecture, and sales. At IBM, Tony focuses on client outcomes, and these are his words, value orchestration through the application of technology. So it sounds pretty fancy, but Tony's very technical, so any of the technical questions, you can just shoot them right at him. Thanks for being here, Tony. And finally, Matt Bostwick, who has whakapapa to Ngāti Mahuta and Ngāti Pukeko, is partner director for Microsoft New Zealand. Matt has previously worked in sectors such as public affairs, local government, software startups, and telecom companies like Nokia. Snooping his LinkedIn, I found out that he's been busy opening a new Matariki-inspired Microsoft space with Ngāti Whātua Arakai, and commenting on the opportunities coming up after Jacinda Ardern recently visited the Microsoft Seattle offices. So very, very cool. I'd like to hear more about that. So, as you can understand why I'm so thrilled to present this panel to you this evening, guests to discuss the future of cloud computing in Aotearoa, New Zealand. And so I'll start us off with a question. Gareth, could you please start us off with explaining a little more about what is cloud computing, how it's relevant to Xero, and what are the opportunities and challenges for small, medium, and large businesses across the country?
Sure thing. So I'm glad that I get to define cloud computing, because it means I can shape the rest of the discussion. My cloud vendor friends may disagree with my definition, but I'll give it a go. The easiest way I think about it is that there's no server in the cupboard. I think in all the industries that I've worked in, there's been this spectre of a server lurking in the cupboard. And this was true in health, so certainly still true in health in some parts. It was particularly true with accountants and bookkeepers, which is where all the growth and success of Xero has really come, is through the accounting and bookkeeping industry. And that industry grew up with the server under the desk, or the server in the cupboard, running desktop software. And the tricky thing about this, or the inefficient thing about the accounting industry doing it this way, was that a business would have a small business, so Xero serves typically small businesses or simple businesses, would have their own desktop software with their own ledger, where they kept all their transactions. And then when it came to tax time or any kind of management reporting, they'd export the data, send that to their accountant, and they might send that on disk, or they might send it by email later on. And the accountant would have their own copy of that in their own desktop software. And this would basically create this situation where there was a lot of back and forth, a lot of inefficient question answering and asking and answering and so on, to be able to prepare books to be filed properly for tax and compliance reasons, which is still the most important function that most accountants play, although business advisory is a sort of bigger and bigger part for them. So the important thing about the cloud is that because there's no server in the cupboard, the server has to live somewhere, and it lives in the cloud. And that means that all of the infrastructure, all of the hardware, typically all of the operating systems as well these days, are taken care of by someone else. And that's becoming more and more important, particularly for small business customers, because the realities are these days, anyone who's trying to run their own server by themselves is very, very vulnerable to things like cyber attacks. And as governments have woken up more and more to the dangers of that and what happens to personal data, privacy controls have increased. And these days the penalties for losing someone's data or having it repurposed in some way are pretty severe, and they're only going to get more severe. And so I think one of the big advantages or opportunities for our customers at Xero is that we take care of all of that for them. So all you need is a web browser pointed at the cloud, the software's there. The part of the business I work in, the other thing that's really important is the ecosystem. So this is not just one cloud application, Xero, but it's all of our friend cloud applications. And connecting them together is a pretty straightforward exercise. Used to be quite an expensive thing that would have to be done between computers in different places, but these days connecting bits of software together can be easy. It can also be very complicated, but generally for small business users, it's not too much of a problem. Xero was born in the cloud, so the idea of taking what was a traditional desktop software application and instead making it something where an accountant and the business that they're serving share one view of the data. And so when the business updates the data, the accountant can see it. When the accountant updates the data, the business can see it. And that just takes out a whole lot of the pain points and difficulties that used to exist in the on-premise model of accounting. From a opportunity perspective though, digital literacy, cloud literacy, so an understanding of it from small business is still pretty small, generally speaking. The small business economy is about 90% of the global economy. So most businesses in the world are small businesses. But of those, roughly 10% of small businesses who could have an e-commerce front end have an e-commerce front end. So roughly 10% of small businesses that are involved in retail actually have some kind of e-commerce thing going on. So they're digital, they're in the cloud. Whereas in larger firms, that's more like 25%. That still sounds like a small number to me, but I think that's quite stark in terms of the challenge for small business there, which is really about that awareness and understanding and enablement to be able to find themselves in the cloud.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Teresa,
Yeah.
could you tell us about how cloud computing is fundamentally changing business financials and IT planning?
Sure. So I basically call on large banks, right? So it's a very different type of a customer than what Gareth was just talking about. But even if you look at some of the medium-sized companies, right? You're thinking about, in the past, what they would do if they had an IT project coming up. They'd have to plan for it for a whole year, or maybe even more. Make a 3-year plan, and then go to the board, ask for funding, have a plan for how you're going to roll that out. And then you'd come to finally being able to purchase your hardware, your software, and your integration teams, and putting all of that together. And maybe things have changed in the business, right? So, the ability to be able to react to what's happening in your own business is really difficult when you have that longer horizon for planning. So that's kind of, what was happening probably 10, 15 years ago. And, a lot of times you would have people in the organization who were just there to be able to build IT infrastructure on the back end. And it may not have had anything to do with the business that you're in, right? It was just the table stakes to be able to conduct your business. So I think that with cloud computing now, that's completely changing. It's being flipped on its head, right? The whole idea of being able to plan, in the year, deliver quickly in, what we call sprints, and deliver in microservices, being able to not have to worry about that back end of servers and what you were talking about with the server in the closet or under the desk, or in some of these large organizations, a full data center maintenance, and worrying about your planning for that whole back end. You basically are able to outsource that to an organization like Google Cloud, or like Microsoft or AWS or any of the other cloud providers. And they take care of that part, and then you're able to focus your effort on something that's really valuable to your business, and being able to be more agile and being able to roll out solutions faster to meet demand of your actual business. So I would say that the whole financial model around that planning, around paying for hardware, software, and the model has basically changed completely because of this way to be able to scale differently up and down, based on what your business needs. So it's really changed quite a bit.
Yeah, thank you, Teresa, and for bringing up data centers. So Matt, I wonder if you could tell us a little bit, or bring us all on the same page of what is a hyperscale cloud data center, and then what are the impacts of companies like Microsoft investing in building such centers in New Zealand?
Two very good questions. So there's a bunch of different definitions of what a hyperscale data center is. And so we could kind of, argue about that. That I've seen some that talk about the square footage, like 10,000 square feet is the size of the building, and if it's under that, it's not hyperscale. But so there's all those different scenarios. I think, for me, when I think about it, it's not just about the size or the scale of the building. It's a whole bunch of other different things, and maybe it's helpful just to kind of paint a picture about what Microsoft is doing, so people can kind of understand what that means. Because what we are doing is building a hyperscale data centre region in Aotearoa in New Zealand, and that's the first thing. It's not one data centre; it's 3 physical buildings, and they're all interconnected with fibre. And the idea is that if the cable to New Zealand is cut, the fishing boat goes over and pulls up the cable. The internet still works. Can you believe it? Like, your applications that are running still work. Your Office 365 emails still work. You just can't email anyone in Australia. I'm sorry about that, but you can email your friends in New Zealand. So that's kind of what we're talking about. It's massive scale, it's bigger and broader and more complicated than anything we have in New Zealand at the moment. So that's kind of what hyperscale is, and generally people talk about the Googles, the Microsofts, the AWSs. It's also part of a global footprint, a global fabric, and ultimately it shouldn't really matter. And it's kind of interesting, cloud is cloud. As you said, it's kind of, where's the server? I don't know, it doesn't matter. It's in the cloud. I just need a web browser. So then the next question for me is, well, if it doesn't matter, why are companies like Microsoft and others talking about spending hundreds of millions of dollars to build that infrastructure here in New Zealand? So that brings me to the second part of your question, which is, so what? I kind of feel like it's a little bit like the internet is finally coming to New Zealand. I actually do. It's like New Zealand has got a really high propensity for use of cloud, and Xero is a great example. You think about small businesses and accountants and bookkeepers. You go to the US, they're still using on-prem spreadsheets, servers. They might have an old copy of another type of accounting software that's running on a server under their desk. It's actually amazing. New Zealand is one of the most cloudified countries on earth, and I'm sure you'll back me up. I mean, we see it with Office 365. New Zealand has got one of the highest adoption rates of Office 365 in that small business space of anywhere in the world. And all of that data, same with Xero today, will sit in Australia or Singapore or the US or wherever the physical data centre might be. So what's the big deal? Why would anyone bother spending all that money to bring it here when we've got a few cables? I think there's 2 reasons, probably actually 3. The first one is data sovereignty, and this idea that it's important where the data physically is. We could debate this non-stop, whether that's actually important. What I think is important is the perception that data sovereignty matters. Whether or not it matters or doesn't matter, the perception that it matters has been a blocker that stops companies from taking advantage of all the good things that they can get out of cloud. So that's the first one. Application performance. There are some big chatty, systems of record that, if you were to put them somewhere overseas, but all of your other things that you're trying to do are physically located here in New Zealand, you would get bad performance. And so those organisations, think mainframes and core banking and the tax system and all those big things, they stay in New Zealand, in an old school legacy tin shed or under the cupboard, stairs, whatever. So that application performance is important. So we can now take some of those big applications, build them in the cloud, and start to infuse AI and all these other things that come baked in cloud. And the last one, which some people forget, but I do think is really, really important, is sustainability. And so when we think about how we're designing the data center region, it's not a data center, it's a region, data center region, it will be the greenest Microsoft data center region anywhere. And then the next one that we build will probably be greener again, but it will be the most sustainable. And it's a big part of how we've thought about it. That's where you get your electricity from. 100% sustainable electricity generation. It's also about the efficiencies you get when you share physical resources. And so we've done lots of studies and happy to share them and work with many organisations that look at that. But when you look at what the sustainability impact is and the footprint of a business when they move their core computing into true hyperscale cloud, it's significantly lower than if you're running all of that stuff yourself. So those are probably the three that I think of.
Awesome, thank you. And so now the panel so far has been pretty polite, pretty like matter of fact. I'm going to try to bring in a little
Gloves
more
off.
controversy here. And Tony, thank you for agreeing to let me ask you this question. So what were the major promises of cloud computing and how have these panned out?
Yeah, it's a fantastic question. Thanks, Danielle. I think the panel is absolutely right, and they just described the advantages of cloud compute and what it brings, or what it could bring. But the reality is not quite as it might seem. If we look back over the last, 10 years of cloud adoption, I would characterise that as wave one or chapter one of cloud adoption. And we've seen quite a significant change in behaviours within clients and enterprises as they move to cloud. And that's had to happen because the cloud cost paradox. And that is where people move to cloud and think they're going to save money and they haven't. And so the business case was predicated on a financial win, a benefit, and it didn't quite pan out. And so some of those clients have actually, a bit of bill shock has been experienced and they've moved back. But then when you stop and analyse, why? It's because they lifted and shifted. They took what they did today in a bricks and mortar data centre and they moved it. And that has no benefit because you're just moving data centre. Effectively, a cloud data centre is just a data centre. Somebody had to buy compute and put it in racks and run it and operate it and feed power to it. And sustainability, right. I love that you raised that. The clean green, electricity generation in New Zealand is 80% green technology. So you can have a green data centre and that's an export if we think of cloud compute as an export. But what we need to do is shift our mindset because cloud is not about technology per se, it's actually what it enables you to do, and that's change your mindset and your approach. And that's actually what Xero has achieved, I think, in some ways, is I've looked at cloud as an opportunity to build a business and do it on a cloud platform. And that means they changed their culture and their approach. They weren't tied to things, they decided to change from a CapEx model to an OpEx model. And that OpEx model is allowing flexibility, which is one of those advantages of cloud. So that means you've got to be born on the cloud. You're looking for cloud native solutions, not moving your existing and putting it in that data centre. I've worked with many, many clients, many of them government agencies, and I don't think a single one of them saw a cost saving. They saw cost increases over the last 10 years, and so we need to flip the paradigm. So that might sound like I'm anti-cloud, but actually I'm not. I think it's a hybrid cloud world. And I think if we can help our clients to shift that conversation around culture and mindset and go, you know what, you've got to modernise. You need to start thinking about Xeros and how they've achieved it. Don't move what you have. But I want to ask a question actually of the audience. How many, as a percentage, what percentage of workload, and by that I mean servers under the desk, servers in the cupboard, servers in racks, how many servers do we think have been moved to the hyperscaler, to the cloud? As a percentage, chuck one out. Anybody?
Something like 30%.
Yeah. Any other? 40. Where was it? 40. 40. Yeah. Any other takers?
Nice.
Yeah, it's less. It's about 25%. So when we put it in a global context, cloud is an evolution in technology, but it isn't the end, and it's slow to adopt. New Zealand, I think you're right, has sort of run it at boots and all, and we've perhaps moved more workload than other geographies. But it's quite interesting to understand that 75% of workload is still in either sovereign data centres within countries, or they're in private clouds, or they're in sovereign data centres and sovereign clouds. They haven't moved to the hyperscaler, and we need to think about how we're going to shift those. And those are the people who are wave 2. That's chapter 2. And that's really about modernising those application stacks towards containerised applications, if you know what that means. And that really is,
I don't think they know.
No, okay.
Hybrid cloud, containerized, edge computing. Just bring us all on the same page, please.
Let's go back one step. In the 90s, we used to deploy things in servers in the cupboard under the stairs. And that was a physical box that we bought, and we put an operating system on it, and we put a business service on top and consumed it, and that was great. And we did that lots and lots. Clients might have 2,000 or 3,000 of these things. And then at the end of the 90s, a company called VMware appeared and said, you know what, I want to do that differently. And they did something, and they virtualized the hardware with a platform that allowed you to run one machine but put lots of little slices of operating system on that machine. And that was a hypervisor. That hypervisor has now evolved again. So in the same way that we've virtualized the hardware with a hypervisor, we're now virtualizing the operating system with containers. And Kubernetes and other platforms are really container orchestration platforms that allow you to do that. So why would you do that? Well, the same reason VMware existed. You have a one-to-one relationship application to a server, and it's not very efficient. But if you can go and make a hypervisor for it and put 10 applications on one server, you're getting there. Sustainability, and now you need less server engineers because you've got less physical kit. But if you can put applications on there and take away the operating system, that's a huge saving.
Yeah.
And if you can do that on a cloud provider, that's another saving again.
I was just going to pick up on that hypervisor thing. It's really interesting, when you talk about how many workloads have gone to cloud. When you look at the US as a market, and you look at organisations today that are thinking about what their technology future is, the ROI for them to move to cloud is usually significantly higher than it might be for an organisation in New Zealand, because so many of them haven't gone down that virtualisation path compared to, percentage-wise, in New Zealand, where a lot of organisations have already done some of that. So the difference between where they are now and what they would get in cloud from lifting and shifting is not massive. But I'm sure we'll talk about where we're all going to go with this, because you're absolutely right, lift and shift is yesterday's game.
Yeah.
Yesterday's game.
I'll ask maybe one more question around false promises, and then I promise we'll get to the future. So, Teresa, what are you seeing in terms of false promises versus true benefits?
Well, I kind of agree with what you were saying around, people thought, oh, well, we're going to save so much money. And it wasn't actually the case. It really depends on, garbage in, garbage out, right? So you weren't modernizing the applications prior to transferring them over to the cloud. So you actually do need to have that modernization process and think about your business, slightly differently. The other thing that I think was a false promise was that, we're just going to put something in the cloud and we're done, right? We're modern now. That's it. We're ready to go. But it actually doesn't work that way, right? You need to be developing in the cloud. You need to be modernizing your processes with your workforce, right? You need to be modernizing how you work together and how you innovate for bringing new applications in. So we've really seen it was really more of a process challenge and changing the way that you work. And then the other thing was, really around modernizing what you're bringing into the cloud as you're going into that journey to really get the benefit of what you're able to do in your digitalization plan.
Okay. And I think maybe we'll turn a little bit to the future now. Gareth, could you tell us about what you're seeing in terms of uptake and trends?
Yeah, sure. Well, so the obvious starting point is that the world's been a little different for the last couple of years, and one of the things about being forced to work from home, which a lot of businesses were, or just not having access to physical premises, suddenly makes the benefits of having software in the cloud pretty obvious. So a lot of, with Xero, certainly we saw a big uptick in the number of, I suppose, taking traditional accounting records or e-commerce instances or anything like that, any kind of software system that was on-premise into the cloud. It was certainly an incentive for people realising that, you know, maybe life was going to be a little bit different, and it was a real benefit to be able to just point a browser at something and be able to carry on. That was a big driver. Whereas New Zealand is interesting for us because we started here. And so New Zealand has you know, as you pointed out, Matt, the much better adoption perhaps than some other places. We actually did some research, some behavioural research on people in all of our different geographic markets. New Zealand and Australia are the big markets for Xero, but the UK is not far behind, and then we're also active in US and Canada and things. And one of the things that really came out of it was that in New Zealand and Australia, there are many more adopters. So they sort of put it into adopters and delayers, looked at small businesses and said, you know, how sort of cloud ready are these businesses, digital ready are these businesses? And you know, New Zealand and Australia were more prepared, but it was still only about 20%. So when we actually surveyed businesses and said, you know, who of you are just ready to get right into this sort of thing, boots and all, it was still only about that 20% mark, which is coincidentally very similar to the sort of movement to cloud and things of server infrastructure. Yeah. The kinds of barriers to that, the things that make it hard for people, is actually trying to understand what the options are that are out there. So, you know, if you're a small business and, you know, talking about the core business before, you want to be doing your small business. You don't want to be mucking around with other things, and you certainly don't want to have to learn everything there is to know about technology just to be able to make progress. And so when you're confronted with just a raft of different options and possibilities and all of those sorts of things, it makes it really, really hard. And that's a significant obstacle. And what's compounding that, I think, for us now, we're certainly finding this as a business, and we know our customers are as well, is there's a big skills shortage and a really big knowledge shortage. So trying to find people who can actually understand and help and sort through all those possible options is getting very difficult, and it's staying difficult. And so that's a significant barrier really to businesses being able to do that. One of the things that is helping us here in New Zealand and Australia and the UK, it's helping Xero as a business, but I'd like to think it's helping us all make progress as well, is that governments are really getting on board with this as well. So they're driving, they recognise that they can reduce costs for all of us as taxpayers if they either mandate or drive or incentivise the use of these kinds of technologies in business processes. So Inland Revenue here, the Australian Tax Office in Australia, the authorities in the UK and Singapore and other places all have big programs of work where they're basically pushing businesses to do the kind of cloud-based digital integration. And as a reward for that, if you like, they make it a lot easier for those businesses to be able to get on with doing the things they need to do in terms of filing tax and things. So that government-driven transformation is actually, it's a big tailwind for all of this as well.
Cool. And Matt, what are you seeing in terms of transformations around Aotearoa?
Yeah, there's plenty. I want to mention probably the most exciting, and it goes back to what you said at the start around the Prime Minister's recent trade mission to the US, and I'll touch on that. So, here's a question. I like the way you engage the audience. I'm learning. Who can tell me what is the #1 export earner for New Zealand?
I know, but you told me.
Oh, so you're disqualified. Did I hear someone say dairy? Yeah, congratulations, that is #1. So we basically, in the past, have made our money by being lucky that we live in a rainy part of the world, and we have reasonable soils now that can grow grass, and then we get these cows and we put them on the grass, the rain and the grass grows, and then we milk the cows. But that, you know, climate change could impact that, consumer decisions could impact that, sustainability of the soil and, you know, putting nitrates in to grow grass could impact that. Who can tell me what the second most... Yes, okay, go on, come on. Come on. It was tourism, but it's not anymore.
COVID.
Education was in there, but it's not that anymore. Our second biggest export earner is tech. So all we need to do in the future to be prosperous and happy and live wonderful lives is just have lots of really smart people creating IP and then selling that IP weightlessly. There's no ships or aeroplanes or anything that you need. Weightlessly selling it to the rest of the world. And we've got some great examples, Gareth, like Xero, of organisations that do that incredibly well. So that's the most exciting change in the shift that I've seen. And what I think the Prime Minister did in taking that delegation to the US and spending time in Seattle. When was the last time a New Zealand Prime Minister went to Seattle? Why Seattle? Because it's the home of Microsoft, it's the home of Amazon. You know, it's one of the big, exciting, burgeoning tech hubs. And so we were really lucky. We were able to host the Prime Minister for a day at Microsoft talking about AI and ethics, talking about cybersecurity, actually. She spent an awful lot of time talking about cybersecurity and what the impact of that is on nations. By the way, Microsoft has 8,500 cybersecurity professionals and 24 trillion cybersecurity signals every day that they're dealing with. And in April, Microsoft released a paper that said that they had actually seen an increase in cyber attacks on Ukraine from Russian-aligned actors that gave them reason to believe that a physical land-based attack was imminent. And they rang a few people and said, hey, this is what's happening, because they were able to see what was happening in that cyber attack space. So that's probably the most exciting thing for me. New Zealand as a exporter of technology, of IP built on technology. And that's another reason why I think it's really exciting to have some of the physical infrastructure here, you know, those physical data centres. You know, as a developer, as an innovator, you can have an idea on Monday and build it in your backyard and release it to the world at the click of a button on Tuesday. And so that's kind of cool. There's just a couple of others that I'd love to touch on. The way we work is changing. The way we buy, sell, and transact is changing, and that's all pandemic-led. So you think about Zoom and Teams and hybrid work and all of that stuff. That's pretty crazy. The skills challenge. Can I just say that this is not a talent issue. We have incredible, talented people in New Zealand. It's actually a diversity issue, because only 27% of people in tech are women, 4% are Māori, and less than 3% are Pacific people. So if we want to solve the skills challenge, we actually need to broaden the pool of people who are thinking about technology as a career, as an option, because I've been lucky enough with Microsoft. We work with Tupitoa, who's an organisation that brings Māori and Pacifica interns into tech, and I've worked with a number of interns. I can tell you, they're amazing technologists, but no one had ever said, here's a way for you to have a pathway into tech, until Tupitoa came along and did that. So that's cool. The other thing I was going to say is rapid increase in the use of AI. And infusing it into business processes and using AI to do things, not to replace humans, but to augment humans. And a great example is some work that we're doing with Landcare Research, Manaaki Whenua, around using AI to look at land use and changes in forest cover. You know, satellites and images and AI engines and all that good kind of stuff, which then turns into predictions around what happens with sustainability and all that good kind of stuff. So I think probably the last thing I would say is Teams. So Microsoft Teams started life as a kind of a video conferencing platform. Well, that's how people would have experienced it, and a lot of people would have experienced that during the pandemic. I think, you know, we had a 13 times growth in Teams usage in a couple of years, you know, from 20 million to 270 something million in a very short period of time. But what it is now is effectively an operating system that brings a whole lot of different things into one place. And a good example of that is I get told every day how I could be more effective through AI baked into Teams that's telling me who I'm talking to, how much time I spend talking to different people in my team, where I'm putting my effort and my focus, whether I was distracted in meetings by emailing. I get an email from an AI machine that says, here's 3 things you could do to be a more effective person in your job. And so all of that stuff being baked into the tools that we use, to me, that's a really interesting scenario. And we're doing some work with New Zealand organisations that are starting to build that into their own platforms. So there's a few ideas.
No, we could. I could continue a conversation like for hours on how like people's lives are changing with those tools and the kind of mental models and the way people understand those suggestions. Yeah, very, very fascinating. But I did want to ask Tony, from a technology point of view, what trends are you seeing there, and where do you see us in the future?
Us being NZ or technology generally?
Oh,
Both.
I think
Maybe
both. Both would be great.
Firstly, yeah, exactly right. AI is critical, but it doesn't replace humans, or it shouldn't replace humans. A few years ago, there was a lot of language, I suppose, in the media and conversation around water coolers that AI was actually going to automate my job and I would be out of a job and there'd be a devolution of roles, and eventually, people would end up slipping down a stack and a lollipop man gets made redundant because now a computer science grad is turning the sign. And actually that's not true. What's actually happening is, to talk about something that Matt mentioned as well, is our people and skills shortage. We do have a shortage, and I'm going to give you some stats in a minute. So really automation is going to be the thing that keeps us operating. So I will talk to a client and they'll say something like, I'm losing my staff and my skills and capability in certain areas and I need to augment that. And what they really need to do is automate their environments. They need to automate everything to make up for the shortfall in skills and people. So let's give you some stats, because it's quite dire. ICT as an industry in all Western countries right now, 40% roughly of those ICT workers are actually baby boomers. And this is not boomer bashing. This is illustrating a problem. I'm a Gen X, and there's about 39% of us in the ICT industry, which is good, but that leaves 20% for all the others. So where's our skills and talent coming up through those generations to take over? So the leaders of tomorrow are going to inherit a workforce that is probably about 40% smaller, and that's going to happen around 2025, 2026. When 90% of baby boomers will be eligible for retirement. Eligible, maybe not take it, but will be eligible. There are certain industries, sectors perhaps, some based in Wellington that we won't name outright, where that percentage is really high, like 70%. And they're facing an evacuation of people on an order of 50% in the next 3 years. And they are the same organisations that are charged with transformations and driving new digital services for citizens. So where's the workforce coming from? And that's the big question, and that's why we have to keep kids in STEM, and we have to keep them growing into tertiary and pathways. And IBM has a program, it's called P-Tech, that does that for lower decile schools, and we call these new collar workers, where we don't bring them to uni, we get them ready for work at 18, straight into the workforce. That's the primary objective. And
Nothing wrong with university though, by the way.
No, nothing.
We're helping.
Present company accepted. That's all good. And those sorts of programs are going to be really, really critical, but private industry can only do so much. Government needs to legislate, and that means we need to grow our tech economy, because A, it's a really good export, and P, we've got to grow our people into STEM-related research and areas for our economy to continue. And that's really critical. So what do I see as tech emerging? Perhaps we'll pivot a little bit. Cloud is really the future, but it's going to change. It's not going to look like what we have now. So whilst wave one has been a bit of hit and miss, Wave 2 is really where we're putting on our bets, and I think it's going to look different to what we have. Remember what I said, cloud is not a destination, it's a journey. You keep going, and technology is going to continue to evolve. So the hyperscaler view we have now in 5 years will be different. And two ways that's going to change will be industry clouds. Industry clouds are already here, they're already present. IBM can give you a financial services industry cloud today, and that's distinct to a hyperscaler cloud, which is, think t-shirt sizes. You need a thing, it's a commodity service, it's a t-shirt size. Not all industries, regulatory industries, for example, around financial services can achieve that. So if you're a bank, you could become a virtual bank and not require any of the servers underneath the desk, and you could do that on an IBM cloud. The other way it's going to change is the cloud is going to devolve to the edge. So at the moment we're centralizing, everything's coming into these massive data centers. So make no mistake, somebody still runs the tin. It's still sucking power.
That's right.
But now you don't have to worry about it or buy it. But now it's going to devolve back out to the edge, because guess where all our data is generated? And the edge. So if you're a manufacturing plant and you run equipment and you want to manage that equipment, it's going to have sensors and process logic controllers all over it, and they're all data points. And you don't want to aggregate that to your cloud, maybe for cost, maybe because you haven't got enough bandwidth, there's just too much of it. What do you do with all this stuff? You're going to want to keep it at the edge and use it at the edge. And so that's starting to become a real thing. How can we take what was the domain of the hyperscaler, an exponential service, an AI-based capability, and how can we take a miniature version of that and push that to the edge, consume a data point, and get a business outcome? And that's really two of the big sort of swings I see over the next few years. But we have to fix our talent and skills gap first to keep us growing. Yeah.
Great. And so I was going to open it up to the audience now, but if there were some words that you wanted to, if there was something that you wanted to fit in first, leave it up to you.
Sure.
I'll
take that. So going with, the approach, I liked the approach. So I'm going to ask you all, who uses Google Maps in this room? Do you use it every day? Yeah. Can you even imagine yourself like getting somewhere without a Google Map? Right. It's just become part of what we do, right? Every day we walk out with our phone, and we map where we're going. Guess what happens to that information? Does anybody know?
Google makes a lot of money out of that.
Yeah. Well, and what about when you're trying to find information about something on the internet? What do? You Google it, right? So all of that input, right? That's input. That's those data points that you talked about. Every single time you are Googling something, every time you map a location, all of that becomes a data point, right? And all of that becomes part of this ecosystem in the cloud that provides additional information to you and benefit to you. But then we, as Google, would take that and develop more innovation, right? Innovative ways to do different things. Raise your hand if you've heard of Google Earth Engine. Okay, so a few people have heard of Google Earth Engine. So that's basically a project that started, as a side project. We call it at 10x thinking at Google, and we have these projects on the side, and that is now coming mainstream, and it's actually photographing the Earth, right? So what we'd be able to do with a lot of that information is bring it back to something like sustainable farming, right? Or potentially in the housing market, with understanding valuations better, in the market without needing to, have expensive processes in order to do that, right? It's actually captured right in Google Earth. So I suppose that, it's really about your imagination of what comes next with those kinds of technologies that are already out there that you use every day. But then how would you bring that in and talking about, what could be possible, right? And, maybe, you come up with the idea of how better to use that. And I think that is what really makes something like cloud computing and some of these applications so interesting, is how we might be able to improve our time on the earth, right? And be able to make more money or less money or make things more efficient. So I just wanted to kind of close by just saying that, really that innovation is, up to every single one of you, right? You can make the difference, and you can probably pull together, some amazing way, to solve some of these problems that we're going to be facing over the next few years. A lot of the technology is already there in the cloud. So be creative.
Any more comments before I?
Let's have the questions.
Yeah. Questions from our audience. Yes. Yep.
So the numbers that I forget who quoted about in terms of transferring to the cloud were really low. Are there any obvious reasons for this? Is it purely not invented here, or fear of the unknown, or is there something else going on? Is it capacity?
Is that the 25% workload?
Yeah.
No, it's because it's really complex.
It's dollars.
Yep.
Possible.
Cost.
I mean, it's really simple. Running a business.
Yep, it's really complex. You can't. Cloud makes it appear that the industry is simplifying things for you, and as an end consumer, maybe it has, but actually it's really complicated. And in fact, it's more complex now than it ever has been. And organisations that have grown up, perhaps evolved organically, they've got a really complex environment, and some of those are massive. Shifting that to cloud, unpicking 20 years of organic development is really complex. It takes a very long time, and so it's not cost effective. Here's an interesting stat, I'll throw this out there. Telcos, 70% of all telcos today still run their core business, because they're a transaction-based business, on a mainframe.
Yeah.
It's kind of interesting. Yeah, on a mainframe.
Does Xero maintain their own data centres, or do they outsource?
No, so we're on a public cloud, so we use AWS for
Okay,
our
right.
infrastructure. Yeah. But we
Because
did
obviously there's different layers of cloud.
cloud, yeah.
Cloud is a very nebulous term.
Yep.
So
True.
it includes software as a service,
Yep.
which
So
is
our-
what Xero
Yes.
is delivering.
Our topospheric cloud is
and then you've got the
sitting on
platform
the-
and
yeah.
infrastructure as a service as well, which is kind of what
we actually
Microsoft
did do the lift and shift that,
Yeah.
that Tony was describing before, and yeah, the costs didn't go down, but they did start to go down as that the business of using the cloud in the way that it's intended to be used.
Yeah.
So moving the
But,
workloads into.
I mean, for me at least, the internet is just another software distribution mechanism. And if you look at the cloud services as just another way of delivering software to people. Now, whether that's low-level software where you're kind of micromanaging exactly how all the transactions are managed and everything, or whether you're handing over to a service such as Xero, which kind of, I guess, standardises the process, how things are handled.
And let's
It's all just software distribution.
Yeah, just summarizing for our live stream viewers that the internet is software as a service. Yeah. And there was another question? Yeah.
Yeah, so firstly, it was mentioned that Xero started off using an OPEX kind of model, and then, CapEx kind of model, and then they pivoted to OPEX. So what inspired such a change? How were the right leaders sure that it was going to benefit the business and the long term?
So Xero moving from a CapEx to an OPEX model.
Yeah, I can repeat that question back if you like. So yeah, the change that happened was that the traditional industry, so the way that the accounting industry used desktop software and those sorts of solutions, that was a CapEx model. So you had your typical accounting practice or a small medium business would have to, well, to your point, plan for the hardware, the infrastructure, the people to do the work and so on, to install the software, pay probably upfront license costs and those sorts of things. What Xero did was to take a very traditional industry like that and offer instead a subscription-based, cloud-based service, so that the only real installation required for a small business is point your browser at the thing and put your credit card in, of course, as well. But the way that happened was recognising what kind of opportunity was coming in that wave one of cloud. Like there was something there. So looking, and the way that Rod Drury, the one who founded it, was looking at it was he was basically looking for an industry that he knew was behind and often looked at in dismissive terms, like, oh, they'll never really, come along with us. This will be the last industry that anyone modernises, kind of thing, which was untrue. And the industry was actually ready for a different way of doing things. And small businesses, capital is always a constraint. It's really tough. If you're running any kind of small business, you're always watching how much money is in the bank, and it's really hard to get more money to pay for big purchases. So to take out what used to be a big purchase and turn that into just something that you do month on month is a really helpful sort of transformation. But yeah, that's an entrepreneur looking at, here's an old system, here's a new way it could be, and taking a bet that they were more ready than everyone thought they might be.
Right? Yes.
First of all, thanks very much for your time. So you were talking about how Microsoft is currently building a bunch of hypercenters. I'm interested in moving a lot of those data centers onto, closer to where your customers would be. How much of that, you were saying before that some of it is to do with performance, where you can increase speed, but then some of it is to do with data security. I can imagine as well, these days with wanting to kind of make supply chains more robust and move things back onto onshoring a lot of stuff. How much of the decision to build is the performance just a happy accident, or is it the other way around? What is the kind of thinking behind why you move a data center to New Zealand?
Yeah, location of data centers.
Yeah, it's interesting. When I started at Microsoft, the closest Microsoft cloud data center region was in Singapore. And we would go and talk to organizations and say, how you're running that really inefficient Exchange server under the desk, and someone's job is to just patch it and look at it and make sure it works. Well, how about you don't do that? Put everything into Office 365 and just have this magic of the software distributed on the internet, and we'll upgrade it and we'll manage it and we'll patch it and we'll secure it. And everyone went, oh, Singapore, okay, that's fine. And then kind of it came a little bit closer and it came to Australia. And everyone said, oh, I want to put my stuff in Australia. I don't want it in Singapore. I'm like, yeah, but it's the cloud. Who cares? It just works. It doesn't matter. You don't need to worry about it. And then, a few years later, it was like, oh, no, New Zealand's next. And then what will be next is that capability going into closer and closer to where the compute, transaction happens.
Yes.
We're working with Fonterra around building IoT sensors that go into milk vats and onto trucks and start to use AI to think about how they can optimise, reduce carbon footprint in terms of fleet management, and how you can give better insights into what's happening on the farm and all that kind of stuff. So ultimately you might then have, as Tony said, elements of that compute capability infused right at the edge, right at the farm gate. It still might be part of a fabric, but that fabric is kind of spreading and getting further and further out. There's lots of things that sit in behind the business decision to do it, but ultimately it's a rational kind of ROI decision that says, if we build this data center, will people use it? Will it get filled up? One of the things that it's worth just mentioning, IDC did some work around what the growth in public cloud revenues will be in New Zealand. I think It was about 1.7 billion in 2020. It's going to be 3 something in 2024. But what's really interesting about that, so there's your ROI, and if you put some data centres in here, you might speed up that adoption curve. You might get more organisations putting more of their stuff, so you go from 25 to 30 or 35. But what was really interesting about that is if you look at the breakdown of what makes up those cloud revenues, in 2020, a big chunk of it was infrastructure as a service. And a smaller chunk was platform as a service and software as a service. And as we get into 2024, the stuff that's growing really fast is the platform and the software as a service.
Yeah.
The stuff that's kind of not growing very fast is the infrastructure. So my prediction is in the future, cloud computing won't be virtualized machines with stuff running on them. It'll be a whole lot of software as a service elements that are stitched together in a smart little way and then customized for an individual business. A bit like what you said about an industry cloud or
I totally
what
agree.
you talk about. So we can see that happening already, and the analysts are kind of with us on that. I hope that gives you a bit of an insight into.
Yes, and that is an excellent note to maybe tie up this portion of the evening, but we'll have a chance to chat a little bit more. But because we've passed the 7:30 mark, I would love to invite you to join me in thanking our panel. Exceptional. Thank you so much. This is fascinating. Yes, thank you. And let's keep chatting.
Thank you.